General Hospital spoilers reveal that Jason had always been a man of control, precision, and quiet dominance. For most of his life, he lived in the shadows, calculating every move. Cutting emotion out like a surgeon with a scalpel, surviving wars both on the streets and within his own soul. But all that began to shift the moment he laid eyes on Britt again. It wasn't supposed to be real. She wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She was a ghost, a memory buried beneath gunfire and betrayal. A fragment of something tender that had once offered him the faintest taste of something different: peace, chaos, laughter, pain, vulnerability. And yet there she was, not in a dream or hallucination, but walking briskly through a crowded European terminal like the world hadn't paused in her absence. Jason's heart didn't race. It stopped. For one blinding instant, time bent in on itself. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't prepare for, was the growing dread that clutched him with every glimpse of her from the shadows. This wasn't the Britt he remembered. She argued with empty air. She scribbled equations and chemical chains on scraps of paper and tore them apart seconds later. Jason began to wonder if the woman he loved had gone mad, or if she had simply uncovered a truth so impossible that madness was the only survival mechanism left. When he finally confronted her. When she spun around and saw him for the first time, something inside her didn't shatter, it detonated. The look in her eyes wasn't relief, wasn't longing, wasn't anger. It was terror. Raw. Unfiltered terror. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, not to him but to herself. "They said you died. They said it couldn't touch you anymore." Jason wanted to grab her, to hold her, to shake answers out of her bones, but he froze. Her gaze didn't hold recognition. It held warning. In that instant, Jason knew something he hadn't known since the day he walked away from Sonny's empire. He was in over his head. Britt had faked her death, not to escape pain, not to avoid prison. Jason didn't know whether to call a psychiatrist or a priest. But he didn't leave. He couldn't. There was something magnetic in her madness, something familiar. Something that mirrored the chaos always simmering under his own stoic shell. And then it began to happen to him. He heard whispers in his head when no one spoke. He saw shapes in mirrors that vanished when he turned. He lost time. He found notes in his own handwriting, written in codes he didn't understand. At first, he blamed exhaustion. Then he blamed trauma. But soon, he stopped blaming anything. Because deep down, Jason started to believe that what Britt was experiencing wasn't delusion, it was a contagion. And he had caught it. He became obsessed not just with her safety, but with her mind, with her unraveling. He wanted to understand the formulas she sketched, the symbols she etched into wood and glass. The dreams she had that bled into waking life. He needed to decode her before she collapsed, or before he did. He no longer knew what was real, but he knew what mattered. Britt had become the axis of his world again, but this time not as a lover, not even as a memory. She was his mirror. She was his warning. Carried burner devices they didn't dare activate. Jason thought he was protecting her, but soon he realized he was being pulled deeper into something far older. Far darker than any mob war he had ever fought. She whispered about rewriting timelines, about synthetic dreams implanted by rogue WSB scientists. She claimed Jason had been duplicated. That maybe he wasn't even the original anymore. He laughed the first time, until she showed him the scar behind his left ear that he didn't remember getting. Then he stopped laughing. He started to believe her. Jason, the man who once ruled his world with silence and logic, began to spiral. He stopped sleeping. He lost the ability to distinguish day from night. He began drawing the same pattern Britt carved into her walls. He began hearing her thoughts before she spoke. The obsession no longer had boundaries. It consumed him. He wasn't just in love with her anymore. He was becoming part of her, symbiotic, damaged, forever altered. Their connection, once built on tension and tenderness, had morphed into a terrifying dependency. She whispered, "You were always supposed to be the one who followed me into this." And he believed her. Not because he trusted her. Not because he understood. But because deep down, in the last place reason still lived, Jason wanted this. He wanted the madness, the unraveling, the loss of structure. He wanted Britt in her broken form. Because she finally reflected what he had always hidden. That he too was broken. That control had always been an illusion. That his life, his entire identity, was a script written by forces he never questioned. And now, for the first time, he was tearing up that script. Jason no longer chased justice or peace. And Britt? She smiled. Not with joy. But with recognition. Because now, he finally understood. Now, they were the same. And there was no going back. Jason had never been a man who let his emotions define him. His life was built on restraint, order, and the discipline to walk away before feelings clouded judgment. But this time, something shifted deep within him, something undeniable. What had once been a fleeting chapter between him and Britt was now becoming the only story that mattered. What started as a mission to find a woman presumed dead was now unraveling into a consuming obsession, one that neither time nor logic could undo. A love he had never dared admit, even when it pulsed beneath every heartbeat. And now, that love had become the only truth he could hold on to. This new chapter in Jason's life was no longer a detour, it was the destination. The moment he saw Britt again, saw the pain hidden behind her erratic behavior. Saw the fear she couldn't explain and the madness growing beneath her surface, something inside him cracked open. He wasn't just chasing her across cities to protect her from danger, he was trying to bring her back to herself, to the woman he once knew, and more importantly, to the woman he had never stopped needing. Each desperate step he took proved how far things had gone, how deep he had fallen. Every plan he crafted, every lie he told to keep her hidden. Every hour he sat watching her sleep to make sure she didn't vanish again, all of it was proof that this had gone far beyond rationality. Britt wasn't just someone he missed. She had become someone he couldn't breathe without. Jason, the man once praised for his stability and silence, now found himself in the middle of an emotional war zone. Driven not by duty but by something far more dangerous, the need for connection. It was clear now, his love for Britt wasn't just returning, it was transforming into a force he could no longer control. The more he tried to save her, the more tangled he became in her unraveling mind. Her behavior grew stranger, her paranoia sharper, her stories more fractured. But Jason didn't retreat. He leaned in. He listened to every fragment, pieced together every cryptic word, and even when she pushed him away with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, he stayed. Because staying had become his only mission. And each time she said something that didn't make sense, each time she forgot where she was, each time she looked at him with recognition and then confusion, he didn't back away. He got closer. Because this was the only way to bring her back. But in trying to bring Britt back from the edge, Jason was stepping closer to that edge himself. He stopped answering calls from Carly, from Monica. Even from Spinelli. He didn't want to be pulled back to Port Charles, to a world that felt increasingly fake, increasingly irrelevant. All that mattered now was Britt, and his need to feel whole again through her. That need, that driving pulse of obsession and hope, was the true change happening inside him. And it was only getting stronger. Jason began to risk everything. He used old WSB contacts to create false identities. He bribed pilots. He threatened doctors who wouldn't treat her off the grid. Every action he took drew him further away from the man he used to be. He was burning bridges behind him because he knew there was no returning to the past. He didn't want the past. He wanted Britt. And if saving her meant destroying the old version of himself, then so be it. Every time she vanished from his line of sight, panic surged through his veins. Every time she smiled at him, he saw glimpses of the woman she used to be, and it pushed him further into his obsession. He told himself it was about rescuing her. He told himself he had to be strong for both of them. But in truth, he wasn't saving her anymore. He was clinging to her as the last anchor, keeping his soul from drifting into the abyss. This was the new story. And this story was no longer one of survival, it was one of need. Britt had become more than a lost love. She was the reason Jason was still breathing, still moving, still fighting. And that realization terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Because if she didn't come back to him fully, if she couldn't be saved, then who was he now? He had already given up everything to follow her into the dark. He had already become someone unrecognizable, someone who couldn't walk away. The obsession was no longer just emotional. It was existential. Jason found himself replaying their final days before her disappearance, reliving the moments where he had chosen duty over love, silence over confession, sacrifice over vulnerability. And now, with the weight of those mistakes pressing against his chest, he was trying to rewrite the ending. He was trying to undo the silence. To undo the distance. To scream into the void that he had always loved her, even when he hadn't said it, even when he had walked away. But time had moved forward. And the woman standing before him now was no longer just Britt, she was a version of her shaped by trauma, secrets, and fear. Jason wasn't sure he could reach her. But he would never stop trying. This was no longer just about love. It was about survival. His own. Because without her, without the obsession that now defined every breath he took, Jason didn't know who he was anymore. And that realization, the complete loss of self outside of her, was the newest obsession now consuming him. Every word he spoke, every risk he took, every moment he stayed at her side even when she was unraveling, was proof that he needed her more than he ever needed anyone. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't rational. It wasn't even safe. But it was real. This was the change, the shift in his soul that he couldn't fight anymore. This was the moment where Jason Morgan ceased to be a man of control and became a man ruled entirely by obsession and love. He was no longer the silent protector, the stoic enforcer. He was a man who had set fire to everything just to keep following one woman into the darkness. He didn't want a new life in Port Charles. He didn't want redemption. He didn't want forgiveness. He wanted Britt. And he would chase her through every shadow, every nightmare, every delusion, until he found the piece of her that still remembered who they had once been. Because in the end, it wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving himself. And if she couldn't be saved, then neither could he. Britt's words were no longer fragmented expressions of fear, they were full-blown declarations of a reality Jason was only beginning to understand. Her eyes, once filled with curiosity and mischief, now burned with a fevered intensity that sent chills down his spine. She kept whispering about the change, about how the world she once knew was gone, how she had been pulled into something monstrous, calculated, and methodical. It's not just in my head, she kept insisting. It's real. They're real. And they're coming. At first, Jason thought it was the trauma talking, remnants of whatever she had been through while in hiding. But the more she spoke, the more he listened. And the more the pieces began to form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Britt wasn't just unraveling, she was warning him. She had been changed. Touched by something far more sinister than fear or grief. She spoke of a facility in the Alps, of machines that could rewrite memory, of surgical scars that she never remembered getting. She told Jason that sometimes she dreamed of places she'd never been to, people she'd never met, and when she woke up, those memories stayed. They weren't dreams, she said. They were data. Installed. Weaponized. Jason could feel the sickness creeping into him too. Not physically, but something far more dangerous. A creeping distortion of reality. He had become tethered to her survival as though his own soul depended on it. He found himself tracing the scars on her back late at night while she slept. Trying to understand what had been done to her. He began collecting the pages she tore from notebooks, the cryptic symbols she drew when she thought no one was watching. He catalogued her episodes. Her speech patterns, her bursts of clarity followed by terrifying silence. He wasn't just protecting her. He was studying her. And in doing so, he was losing himself. The world around them had shifted. This wasn't about Port Charles anymore. This wasn't about mob rivalries or betrayals. This was about an enemy Jason couldn't see, couldn't trace, but felt crawling beneath his skin. Britt had always been unpredictable, but now she was haunted by things Jason couldn't name. And now those same hauntings were wrapping their claws around him. He began to feel it, the presence. Not in the form of a person, but in the disintegration of logic itself. Surveillance equipment that failed inexplicably. Messages that vanished from encrypted channels. Familiar faces behaving like strangers. Safe houses breached without a trace. Contacts silenced or vanished. Something was watching them. Manipulating them, waiting for the exact moment when Jason would fall too far down the spiral to climb back up. Britt told him about the man in the white coat. The one who never spoke but whose eyes saw through her. She told Jason that the enemy wasn't just after her, they were using her as a gateway. They want you broken, she whispered. Not dead. Broken. Every moment he stayed by her side, every lie he told to keep her hidden, every law he broke to stay one step ahead, it was all leading him deeper into a trap. And he didn't care. He couldn't care. Because turning back would mean losing her again. And that was something he could no longer bear. He told himself it was loyalty. He told himself he owed her this. But in truth, it had become obsession. He watched her in her sleep, afraid that if he blinked, she would disappear again. He stopped calling his family. He disconnected from everyone. His only world was Britt. Her fear became his fear. Her madness became his obsession. And the deeper they went, the more Jason realized that he didn't want to return to the old version of himself. That man was numb, detached. Disconnected from everything except violence and duty. But this new Jason, this Jason who would burn the world down just to keep Britt breathing, this was someone who finally felt. And it terrified him. The enemy, whoever they were, had succeeded in one way. Jason was no longer a threat to them in the traditional sense. He was too consumed now. Too obsessed. Too compromised. But what they hadn't counted on was that in becoming this version of himself, Jason had also become unpredictable. Dangerous. Reckless. And in his desperation to save Britt, he was willing to destroy anyone and anything that stood in his way. Britt wasn't getting better. If anything, she was slipping further. Her hallucinations were now full conversations. Jason intercepted a transmission between WSB operatives, coded, cryptic, but with one message repeated twice: Subject Morgan must not return to Port Charles. Westbourne to be terminated if unstable. That's when he knew, this wasn't just a coincidence. They were targets. They were being hunted. And Britt's instability was the excuse they would use to finish what they started. Jason gathered weapons. He secured a boat. He mapped an escape route. But he knew that they could never truly run. The enemy was in their heads now, in their thoughts, in their doubts, in their love. And it was too late to go back. Everything had changed. This was the obsession now, fighting for Britt, yes, but also fighting the force that had turned love into fear, devotion into madness. Jason no longer knew who he was without her. And if she fell, he knew he would fall with her. Because this wasn't just a reunion. It was a transformation. A possession. A descent into a kind of darkness that Jason had never known existed. And through it all, the only thing that kept him moving forward, the only thing that made sense, was Britt's trembling hand in his. And the silent promise that no matter how far they had gone, they would keep going together. Until the end.